This is the story of a man who lost everything, reclaimed an entire empire, and then made a single fatal mistake that cost him not just his crown, but an entire civilization. By 1380, the Golden Horn was dead, torn to pieces. It was but a shadow of its former self. And then he appears, a fugitive, a penniless exile whose family had been slaughtered. His name was Tokhtamysh. He has nothing except for one thing. He is a Genghisid, a descendant of Genghis Khan, and he will achieve the impossible. He will raise this corpse of an empire, piece it back together, and make the entire world tremble at the word Horde once more. But this is not a story of a great triumph. This is the story of the greatest mistake in the history of Eurasia. Today, you will learn how Tokhtamysh became the #1 startup project of the most fearsome man on the planet, Tamerlane. Why, after uniting the Horde and defeating Moscow, he committed the most irrational betrayal of his life. How one man, Tamerlane, in just 2 strikes, not only defeated Tokhtamysh, but wiped the economy of an entire civilization off the face of the earth. And why the last great Khan ended his life just as he began it, as a destitute exile, completely forgotten. We saw how Mamai, lacking the blood of a Khan, tried to hold on to power and lost. Tokhtamysh was his complete opposite. He was the legitimate ruler, but legitimate power is intoxicating. Tokhtamysh decided he was equal to his creator. He threw down a challenge to the Iron Lame, Tamerlane, and Tamerlane accepted that challenge. This will be a story of 2 titans whose battles on the Kondurcha and Terek rivers became the largest and bloodiest meat grinder of the 14th century. This is a story of how easy it is to unite warriors, but how difficult it is to manage an economy, and how one man, blinded by pride, can destroy a legacy that was built over a century and a half. He ruled for 15 years, but his entire fate was decided in a single day. This is the finale of our series, The Golden Horde. This is Tokhtamysh. We left the Horde in ruins after the Battle of Kulikovo and the fall of Mamai. The empire is dead. It has fractured into uluses, and it seemed its time had passed. But at this very same time, far to the east, another drama was unfolding. A young Genghisid named Tokhtamysh, fleeing for his life, escaped from the powerful Urus Khan, ruler of the White Horde. He had lost everything. His father had been killed. His army was shattered. He fled to Samarkand, into the den of the most fearsome conqueror since Genghis Khan, to Emir Timur, whom we know as Tamerlane. Tokhtamysh thought he was seeking refuge, but Tamerlane did not see a refugee. He saw a tool. Picture Samarkand at the end of the 14th century, the center of the world, a city where the treasures of Asia flow. And in his palace sits its master, Emir Timur, Tamerlane. He is not a Genghisid, but he rules like a god of war. And then, crawling to him, into the palace, comes a ragged fugitive. This is Tokhtamysh. His father, the ruler of Mangishlak, is dead. His own patron, Urus Khan, sees him as a rival and has ordered his execution. Tokhtamysh is on the run, having lost everything. He thought he had come to beg for one last chance at life. He didn't understand that to Tamerlane, he wasn't a refugee. He was a solution. At that time, Tamerlane was waging a difficult war against that very same Urus Khan. He needed a legitimate Genghisid to oppose Urus on the throne of the White Horde. And now, a Genghisid appears on his doorstep of his own accord. This was not an act of mercy. It was a casting call, and Tokhtamysh was the perfect fit for the role. Now let's break down what happened next. This was one of the strangest venture capital projects in history. Tamerlane doesn't just give Tokhtamysh refuge. He gives him cities, money, and most importantly, an army. "Go," he says, "and take your throne." Tokhtamysh goes, and he is immediately crushed by the forces of Uruz Khan. He returns to Tamerlane, again with nothing. Tamerlane, like a stubborn investor, doubles down. He gives him a second army. Tokhtamysh goes on campaign again, and he is crushed again. Any other patron would have executed such a failure, but Tamerlane sees 3 moves ahead. He gives Tokhtamysh an army for a third time. At this moment, fate intervenes. Uruz Khan dies. His sons, one after another, perish in internal strife. The White Horde is left without a leader. And right then, with the seat now empty, Tokhtamysh, backed by the full might of Tamerlane, finally ascends to the throne of the White Horde in 1378. He was certain this was his triumph, but in reality, he was merely a buffer state, the northern shield of Tamerlane's empire. Tamerlane had created the perfect vassal for himself. He did not yet know that he had just forged a weapon that would very soon strike him in the back. So, Tokhtamysh, the former fugitive, is now the Khan of the White Horde. He sits on the throne in Signok solely thanks to Tamerlane. But while he was fighting in the east, a catastrophe had occurred in the west, in the main Golden Horde, the one we discussed in the last episode. The Temnik Mamai, the uncrowned ruler, had just been routed by Dmitry Donskoy at the Battle of Kulikovo. The year is 1380. The 2 main centers of power in the steppe are in ruins. Mamai has been defeated by the Rus. Tokhtamysh is Tamerlane's puppet. Tokhtamysh understands this is his chance. He, the legitimate Genghisid, against the usurper Mamai. He immediately gathers his new troops and marches west, not to help Mamai, but to take his place. They meet on the Kalka River, but there is no battle. Mamai's army, upon seeing the legitimate Khan, simply defects to his side. Mamai flees to Crimea, where he is assassinated. In a single day, Tokhtamysh gained everything. He united the White Horde, the east, and the Golden Horde, the west. The empire, dead for the last 20 years, was whole once again. And the first thing he had to do was prove that he was a real Khan. In 1380, Tokhtamysh stands at the top of the world. He is just over 30 years old. Only yesterday he was in exile, and today he is the master of the united Golden Horde. The entire steppe, from the Volga to the Irtysh, belongs to him, but he has one problem, a huge problem. In the west, the Principality of Moscow, a vassal of the Horde, has just dared to defeat a ruler of the Horde, Mamai, at the Battle of Kulikovo. They haven't paid tribute for 2 years. They've sensed blood in the water. Tokhtamysh understood. He could be a legitimate Genghisid, but if he couldn't force his vassals to pay, his power was a fiction. If he didn't avenge Mamai's defeat, he would look weaker than that usurper. Officially, he was marching to prove that the Horde was alive, but in reality, he was proving it not so much to his vassals as to himself, and, most importantly, to his patron, Tamerlane. He was like a child who, having received a new, expensive toy, immediately tries to prove to everyone that he is worthy of owning it. In 1382, Tokhtamysh gathers an army and marches on Moscow. And here he reveals himself not just as a warrior, but as a cunning strategist. He moves without haste. He spreads a rumor that he is not marching on Dmitry Donskoy, but on his rivals. He captures one Rus prince, then another, and forces their ships to ferry his army across the Volga. He acts so quickly that Dmitry Donskoy is in a panic. He doesn't have time to assemble an army. He abandons his capital and flees to Kostroma, ostensibly to gather his forces. Moscow is left alone, without a prince, without an army, consumed by panic. The townspeople lock themselves inside the Kremlin. For 2 days, they repel Tokhtamysh's furious assaults. The Horde's forces suffer heavy losses, and then Tokhtamysh makes his move. He doesn't take the city by force, he takes it by deception. Princes from Nizhny Novgorod, who were with Tokhtamysh, approach the walls. They swear on the cross to the Muscovites that the Khan is merciful. He has not come for you, they say. He has come for your prince, Dmitry. Open the gates, pay him homage, and he will leave. And the Muscovites, desperate and betrayed by their prince, believe them. They open the gates. In the next second, a massacre begins. The Horde's warriors storm into the city. Moscow, which had not been taken by storm for 50 years, burns to the ground in a single day. Tens of thousands are killed or taken into slavery. Tokhtamysh returns to Sarai with enormous plunder and, more importantly, with the tribute restored. Dmitry Donskoy, the victor of Kulikovo, is forced to crawl back to the Horde for the Yarlik to rule and to send his own son as a hostage. This was the apogee of Tokhtamysh. He had done what Mamai could not. He had proven that the Horde was still the dominant power in the region. He was rich, all-powerful, and, as it seemed to him, invincible. And it was at this very moment, at the peak of his triumph, that he makes his biggest mistake of his life. Tokhtamysh returned to Sarai Batu a conqueror. Moscow was burned. Tribute was flowing like a river once again. He was the undisputed master of the steppes. And he begins to look around. He looks to the south. There, in Samarkand, sits the man to whom he owes everything, Tamerlane, his father, his creator. But Tokhtamysh no longer sees a patron in him. He sees a rival. He thinks Tamerlane is merely an emir. He is not a Genghisid, but I am the legitimate Khan. Why should I have to share the world with him? Hubris, multiplied by the intoxication of power. Tokhtamysh forgets who gave him this power. In 1385, just 3 years after his triumph in Moscow, Tokhtamysh assembles an army. But he does not march on Rus. He marches on Tamerlane. He invades his patron's domains in Khwarezm and Azerbaijan. He thought the student was ready to surpass the master. He did not understand that the Iron Lame does not forgive betrayal. The year is 1385. Let's pause for a second and analyze what is going through Tokhtamysh's mind. He is the ruler of the largest country on the continent. He is a Genghisid, a natural-born king. He has just brought Moscow to its knees, the same Moscow that dared to challenge Mamai. He is young. He is absolutely convinced that he has restored the Horde to the glory of Batu Khan's era. And who is Tamerlane? In Tokhtamysh's eyes, Tamerlane is an upstart, an emir who does not possess the golden blood of the Genghisids. Yes, he is a great general. Yes, he helped Tokhtamysh take the throne. But now, Tokhtamysh sees this help not as a favor, but as a humiliation. He no longer wants to be Tamerlane's project. He wants to be the sole ruler. Tokhtamysh genuinely believed that he, as the legitimate Khan, stood immeasurably above Tamerlane, whom he saw as merely an usurper. He assumed that the emir of Samarkand was now obligated to submit to him. But in reality, he was just the product of Tamerlane's brilliant investments, and now he had decided to fire his chief investor. He was like a man who, having climbed onto a giant's shoulders, spits on the giant's head, not realizing the giant can simply shrug him off. And so Tokhtamysh commits not just a mistake, he commits an act of madness, founded on pure pride. He gathers an army of 100,000 men. He invades Azerbaijan and Khorasan, lands that Tamerlane considers his own. The Horde's forces plunder cities, burn villages, and seize loot. Tokhtamysh stabs his father in the back. Tamerlane is campaigning in Persia at the time. When news of Tokhtamysh's betrayal reaches him, he, according to the chroniclers, flies into a rage. He couldn't believe it. He, the Iron Lame, who had spent years and resources molding this fugitive into a Khan, had been struck by his own son. Tamerlane sends Tokhtamysh a letter. It is one of the most menacing messages in history. He writes, "You were a nobody. I raised you from the dust. I gave you an army. I gave you a throne. And you dared to attack me?" Tokhtamysh replies to this letter with incredible audacity. He declares that it is he, not Tamerlane, who is the true master of the world. All bridges had been burned. Tamerlane halts his Persian campaign. He turns his entire war machine, the most terrifying machine on the planet, northward, towards Tokhtamysh. The Iron Lame didn't just accept the challenge. He decided to personally erase his mistake from the face of the earth. Preparations began for a war unlike any seen before, a war of two titans. Tokhtamysh's betrayal set the wheels of total war in motion. But Tamerlane was in no hurry. For several years, he methodically prepared his strike. He assembled an army the likes of which the world had never seen. He studied the steppe, the logistics, the routes of retreat. He wasn't just preparing for a battle, he was preparing for an annihilation. Tokhtamysh, for his part, was not idle either. He was confident in his strength. He gathered everyone he could, the full might of the united Golden Horde. And then, in 1391, Tamerlane sets out on his campaign. His army is 200,000 battle-hardened veterans. They march through the wild steppe, along uncharted routes, executing a forced march that was a military miracle in itself. Tokhtamysh awaits him. He employs classic Scythian tactics, retreating, luring the enemy deep into his territory, trying to wear down Tamerlane's army with hunger and thirst. But he wasn't luring a Persian king, he was luring Tamerlane. After months of pursuit, on June 18, 1391, the two colossal armies meet on the Kondurcha River. This was the first blow, and it was a catastrophe. June 18, 1391, the Kondurcha River. On one bank, 200,000 of Tamerlane's warriors, an army gathered from all over Asia, tempered in dozens of wars. On the other, the gigantic but less organized army of Tokhtamysh. Tokhtamysh was confident in his Scythian tactics of attrition. He failed to account for one thing. Tamerlane was not just a warrior, he was a genius of military logistics and engineering. His army was not starving, his army was ready. The battle was apocalyptic. Tamerlane's chroniclers describe how Tokhtamysh's horsemen attacked like a cloud of locusts, but they crashed against walls of shields and the iron discipline of Timur's veterans. Tamerlane used his signature move. He allowed Tokhtamysh's forces to drive into his center, and then he struck with two reserve flanks that he had held in ambush. It was a cauldron. Tokhtamysh's army, composed of many different tribes, faltered. The panic that began on one flank turned into a total rout. This wasn't just a defeat, it was a slaughter. Tens of thousands from the Horde were killed, hundreds of thousands scattered. Tokhtamysh's self barely escaped, fleeing the battlefield. He lost his army, his harem, and his treasury. Tokhtamysh, the master of the world, was once again a fugitive. Tamerlane, after sacking Sarai, returned to Samarkand, assuming the lesson had been learned. He was wrong. Tokhtamysh was beaten, but not broken. For 4 years, like a wounded wolf, he hid in the steppes, gathering new forces. He was obsessed with the idea of revenge. He once again assembled an army, once again felt like a Khan. In 1395, he makes his second fatal mistake. He invades Tamerlane's domains again. The Iron Lame was enraged. He realized that Tokhtamysh could not be cured. He could only be destroyed. And so Tamerlane began his second, final campaign. They met on the Terek River. Tokhtamysh had chosen a perfect position, fortified it. He was waiting for Tamerlane. But Tamerlane deceived him again. He feigned a retreat, and then, under the cover of night, his elite units forded the river and struck Tokhtamysh in the flank. The Battle of the Terek was shorter than Kondurcha. It was the finale. Tokhtamysh's army ceased to exist. He fled again, but this time Tamerlane did not turn back. He watched the fleeing Tokhtamysh, and he understood. As long as the Horde's economy was alive, as long as its cities on the Great Silk Road generated immense wealth, this steppe would always give birth to new Tokhtamyshs. Tamerlane made a decision that would change history. He didn't have to kill the Khan. He had to kill the Horde itself. The Battle of the Terek was over. Tokhtamysh's army had been ground to dust. The Khan himself had fled to parts unknown. Any other conqueror would have stopped there. The objective was achieved. The enemy was vanquished. But Tamerlane was not any other conqueror. He was a pragmatist. He saw that the military might of the Horde was not just built on warriors, it was built on money, on the colossal sums of money from trade. The Horde was the bridge between China and Europe. Its cities, Sarai Batu, Azov, Majar, were the richest commercial hubs in the world. And Tamerlane decided to shut down this bridge forever. He did not turn his army into the steppe to chase after Tokhtamysh. He turned his army on the cities, on the economic heart of the Golden Horde. And what happened next was not a war. It was a methodical, cold-blooded destruction of an entire civilization. What Tamerlane did in 1395 was not war. It was an economic death sentence. His army, splitting into several corps, swept with fire and sword through the main arteries of the Golden Horde. Their targets were not warriors, but merchants, artisans, and trade routes. They entered Sarai Batu, the capital of the Horde, one of the greatest metropolises in the world, and they burned it to the ground. They destroyed its palaces, its mosques, and most importantly, its markets. Then they moved on to Azov, Tana, the Genoese trading post, the Horde's gateway to Europe. They massacred the population and obliterated the port. Then Majar, a major center in the North Caucasus, destroyed. Tamerlane wasn't just looting. He was systematically breaking the very foundation of the Great Silk Road that passed through the Horde. Why? To reroute it through his own empire, through Samarkand. Tamerlane thought he was just destroying their wealth, but in reality, he was severing the carotid artery of an entire civilization. His actions were like those of a woodsman who, instead of hunting down a single wolf, Tokhtamysh, decides to burn the entire forest to the ground, leaving the wolf nowhere to live or feed. In a single year, Tamerlane physically annihilated the economic power of the Golden Horde, which had been built over 150 years. It was a blow from which the Horde would never recover. Deprived of its cities, its trade, and its money, it instantly reverted to a feral state. It disintegrated back into the same nomadic ulusons from which Batu had once assembled it. The Great Troubles 2.0 began, but this time it was final. The Khanate of Kazan appeared, then Crimea, then Astrakhan. The empire crumbled into fragments. And what of Tokhtamysh? He became a ghost. The former master of the world wandered the steppes for 10 years, trying to raise a new army, but no one had any use for a failed Khan who had brought an apocalypse upon his own land. He fled to Lithuania. He begged for help from the Rus princes whose cities he had once burned. He became a pawn in other people's games. In 1406, the last great Khan of the Golden Horde, Tokhtamysh, was killed somewhere in the Siberian steppe by his own former commanders. He died just as he had begun his career, a penniless exile. He united the Horde. He made the world fear its name again, and it was he, through his own pride, who led it to a complete and irreversible collapse. And so, the story of Tokhtamysh is the end. In 15 years, he went from a destitute fugitive to an all-powerful unifier Khan, and back again to a ghost killed in the wild steppe. But this was not just his personal tragedy. The real tragedy was that his fall became the fall of the entire Golden Horde. This was not just a military defeat. It was the death of an entire era. Tamerlane, by burning the Horde's cities, destroyed the economic spine that held the empire together. And it showed that power built on pride rather than wisdom is an illusion. Tokhtamysh was a great warrior, but he forgot that you cannot betray the one who created you. He was a Genghisid, but it was he, not the usurper Mamai, who brought the empire of the Genghisids to an irreversible collapse. Our entire understanding of Eurasian geopolitics is fed by this story. The destruction of the Horde created a power vacuum that echoed for centuries. On its ruins would rise the Tsardom of Muscovy, the Crimean Khanate, and the entire future map of Eastern Europe. This was the finale of our series, The Golden Horde. We have journeyed from its formation, through its golden age, the Great Troubles, the rise of Mamai, and finally, the fatal mistake of Tokhtamysh. Thank you for taking this journey with us. If this series was important to you, if you learned something new, the best way to thank us is by liking this video. But the main question is, what's next? We want you to choose our next topic. Write in the comments which series you would like to see more. The great generals of Genghis Khan, Subutai, Jebe, and the Dogs of War? Tamerlane and the Timurids, a deep dive into the Iron Lame to whom we owed so much today. Vote in the comments and we will make the series that you choose. And, of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the start of our next great journey. See you next time.